Alright, ladies and gentlemen, in our last video about evolution, we left off taking a look at all the different ways that evolution can drive selection of varying types of organisms. We talked about disruptive selection, where you can select the rarer types of organisms at either extreme. We talked about stabilizing selection, where you can basically drive probability toward the most common version of an organism. And then we also talked about directional selection, where what can happen is when one version of an organism is more common, natural selection can sort of push the number of organisms toward one that's more extreme. So what we want to talk about now is some of the things that can also alter the types of organisms available. Now, whenever we talk about this, what we're talking about is how your alleles are altered. Okay, so it's actually your alleles that are being altered by this selection process, so that there's different alleles available to the new population. Okay, so one of the things that happens is something we call a bottleneck effect, and this generally happens because of natural disasters or frequently human environmental destruction. But you see here, we always show the bottleneck effect in a bottle, of course. So you see here you have this bottle, and you see all the different yellow and blue and the number of each, okay? Well, the reason we call it a bottleneck effect is because something happens, and again, it could be like an earthquake, a volcanic eruption, humans destroying a environmental home or habitat, okay? And what this does is, because there's only a narrow amount of organisms that remain, the distribution of versions changes. So in here you have what almost looks like more yellow, but at the very least it's an equal combination of yellow and blue. But here, after the bottleneck experience, you have more blue than yellow. And so what happens is, as this group of organisms begins to repopulate, you have a different collection. And so the new repopulation looks different than the original. And the reason that this is important is because you have to understand that this is not natural selection. Sometimes these alterations in variations within an organism, so the types of organisms that are available, is entirely because of random acts of nature. And that could be disasters or our intervention in the environment. Now, other times, it also happens that it's just something called genetic drift, okay? So genetic drift is very similar to the bottleneck effect insofar as it's kind of random that the versions of the organisms that remain were different. But the reason the genetic drift is important is because it's not necessarily because of a disaster or because of a human. Genetic drift is entirely the luck factor. So take a look at this example, all right? So you have these insects. You have a certain amount that are brown and a certain amount that are green. All right. Now, those percentages might perpetuate through a population. The green are probably on the extremes. The brown are the more common version. But frequently, random chance. Now, in this case, we're talking about someone stepping on the bugs. But this is random chance. If this person had stepped down here, you would have more green. But because they stepped up here, you have more brown. And random chance can actually change the genetic variety, or the options or the versions of an organism that are available as populations move from generation to generation. And so that's called a genetic drift, because literally what we're saying is that the combination of genes that give us these variations just randomly kind of changes over time. All right. And as much as that seems like kind of a cop-out, it's important to understand that because of the nature of sexual reproduction and mutation, sometimes random change is just what drives evolution. Okay. Now, another thing, and this actually came out when Darwin was talking about how his finches got blown to the Galapagos Islands, is something that we call the founder effect. So, and Darwin's, this diagram looks example, but looks backwards. But in Darwin's situation, this would be, say, South America. And you actually see it in the beginning of the film where he has the butterfly on the boat, and he's like, "Where did you come from?" Well, he used to say with the finches that there was this general population of finches that existed on South America's mainland. And while they were flying, they got caught in a jet stream and ended up on the Galapagos Islands. And this is the most important thing, though. You see this whole population with all of its varieties of the organisms, but you'll notice that not all of them got blown. And so what happens is, this is another example of how randomness can come into play in terms of the varieties available. Because only these versions of the organism were caught in whatever it is that blew them from one landmass to another, the new group will never have this white version. Or if they do, it'll be in entirely different proportions. Because these are the founders of the new population. And so a population can only grow from what it began as, just like evolution can only change what already existed. So even though the original organism had other varieties, this new population is dependent entirely on the founders. And so we refer to this kind of random variation as the founders effect. All right? Now, the last thing I want to talk about with evolution is one of the ways that evolution plays a role in cells. So it's actually important. Like, Darwin didn't really know that much about cells. We knew about cells since the 1600s, but getting into the details of them and their structures and animal and plant cells, that actually started to really pick up around the time Darwin was doing his work. And so it wasn't really something that he knew a ton about. But it is important for us to talk about how this plays a role in some of the things that we dealt with in cells. So one of the things that you'll notice is over here, I've got mitochondria, okay? And you can actually see them right there on this diagram. And then you'll also notice here we've got, it says photosynthetic prokaryote, but this is actually chloroplasts, okay? Now, this is really important. You'll notice over here, now here's time. And this is more, over here is more modern cells, closer to the now. All right. So what you'll notice is this original cell right here doesn't have any organelles. All right. So that means that you can see right here, it's a prokaryote. Well, one of the things that scientists want to understand, if evolution is true, which we have so much evidence for that is the case, is how do you get from prokaryote to eukaryote? And over here you have some things where it's talking about infolding of the plasma membrane to get us some structures. That's not super important right now, although that is what gives us that nucleus, all right? And this nucleus is what really separates prokaryotes from eukaryotes. But one of the interesting things we believe is that mitochondria and chloroplasts actually started when this organism right here, this kind of primitive eukaryote, tried to eat a mitochondria. And it ate the mitochondria, but did not digest it. And so the mitochondria started to create a mutualistic relationship with the cell that tried to digest it. So this is another example of kind of coevolution, where the mitochondria sort of evolved away from being an independent organism, and the cell evolved away from being an independent organism and using the mitochondria to generate energy. All right. And the same thing kind of happened up here. You can see where this cell tried to eat a chloroplast, another microorganism that was like a chloroplast, and it didn't digest it. And so over here you have yet another mutualistic relationship where the cell that tried to eat and the microorganism that the cell tried to eat developed a mutualistic relationship. Again, it's an example of coevolution, where the chloroplast-like prokaryote was like, all right, I'll just hang out and make energy, and you provide me the other stuff that I need. And so this whole theory of how we develop things like mitochondria and chloroplast actually is something that's known as the endosymbiosis theory. It's endo because they take in, and it's symbiosis because they developed one of these symbiotic relationships. And we actually believe that this is how mitochondria and chloroplast became organelles in cells. And this is a really important thing because this is evidence and an example of how evolution can work on the cellular level. All right, so this one was quite short. So that's it for some of the details of evolution.